A particular special story is never taught in the academies of the Five Kingdoms. They skip over it, deliberately, because if you learn it too young, you start asking the wrong questions. Questions like, who decided alphas led? Who decided omegas follow? Who sat down one morning and said this is how the world works and then made it law? Somebody did. A long time ago, and for centuries nobody dared argue. Until Zale. Now, before I tell you about him, I need you to understand what an omega is in this world. Because it's not what you think. In the Five Kingdoms, designation isn't just biology. It's a whole architecture. A whole system built like a cathedral, tall, intimidating, meant to make you feel small the moment you walk inside. Alphas ruled. They always had. They were louder, stronger, more aggressive by nature. Their scent alone could make a room go quiet. They sat at the heads of tables, led armies, signed treaties, chose heirs. And when they wanted a partner, a mate, they chose an omega. Omegas were prized in the way beautiful things are prized, kept, protected, given everything except the one thing most of them actually wanted, a seat at the table where decisions were made. They presented with a soft scent, something floral or warm or sweet. They were built by nature for bonding, emotionally intelligent, deeply intuitive, capable of carrying heirs. The world called this a gift. Most omegas privately called it a cage. And then there was Zale, Prince Zale of the House Salvain, the third son of a kingdom known more for its military than its mercy. He didn't present at the usual age of 16. He didn't present at 17 either. The court whispered. His father paced. The physicians ran tests and found nothing wrong. He presented at 19. Full, late, overwhelming. And when they told him what he was, omega, he looked at the royal physician for a very long moment and then said, quietly, "Don't put that in the official record." They put it in the official record. Of course they did. But from that day forward, Zale operated as if they hadn't. He studied military tactics. He trained with the guard. He read trade law until he could argue it better than the senior advisors. He learned how to walk into a room like he owned the floor beneath his feet. He also learned something else. Something that changed everything. There are rare flowers in the Salvain mountain ranges. They bloom only in the dry season. Small and almost colorless. Easy to overlook. But when you dry them and burn them slowly, not fast, not all at once, just slowly, they release a compound into the air that reads to an alpha's instincts as the dominant presence of another alpha. Not forever. Not permanently. Just long enough. Zale called it his insurance policy. The world called it the alpha-mimicking incense. Eventually, after they found out. But by then, the story had already happened and couldn't be taken back. King Arvin of Calderir was 23 years old and exhausted in the way that very powerful people get exhausted when they've been responsible for everything since they were too young to fully understand what everything meant. His father died when Arvin was 16. The crown landed on his head while he was still growing into his shoulders. His advisors were older, opinionated, and desperately eager to see him take a mate and produce an heir before, as they delicately put it, political instability could take root. Political instability. That was their phrase for everything they were actually afraid of. What they meant was, you are young, you are unmated, and every alpha lord in the neighboring territories is watching you like wolves watch a lantern left unattended. Arvin was a good king. He genuinely was. He was thoughtful and just and hated unnecessary cruelty in the way that only people who've seen a lot of unnecessary cruelty can. He didn't enjoy court politics. He didn't enjoy the performance of being intimidating. He did it because it was required. Because the role demanded it. Because every single morning since he was 16, someone reminded him what alphas were supposed to be. Strong. Decisive. Unyielding. He was all of those things. He was also quietly, privately, profoundly tired. When the delegation from House Salvain sent word that Prince Zale would be visiting Calderir, officially a diplomatic exchange, but everyone understood what it really was. Arvin agreed because his council agreed first, and it was easier to let them think they'd convinced him. He expected what he always expected. A beautiful omega, nervous, sweet-scented, trained from birth to be accommodating. He expected to feel that alpha pull, that instinct, the biological certainty that this is your match. And then he expected to feel guilty about it because he always felt guilty about reducing a person to a biological response. He did not expect Zale. The delegation arrived at the east gate of Calderir on a morning that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be winter or autumn. Cold enough for breath to fog. Bright enough that the light came in sideways and made everything look like it was made of copper. Arvin stood at the top of the entrance steps. His council flanked him. He was wearing his formal coat, deep navy, gold trim, the kind of coat that communicated I am aware of my own importance without needing to say it out loud. He watched the carriages come through the gate. And then he watched Zale step out of the lead carriage. Tall. That was the first thing. Genuinely, unexpectedly tall. Nearly Arvin's height, which was unusual for anyone and nearly unheard of for an Omega. Broad through the shoulders. His coat was dark green and structured, and he wore it like someone who had never once in their life felt self-conscious. His hair was dark, worn in a loose style that somehow still looked deliberate. He had a scar along his jaw, faint, old, the kind that comes from real accidents rather than decorative ones. And his guards. 8 of them. All alphas. All enormous. Moving in perfect formation around him, not in the way that guards move around someone they're protecting, but in the way that soldiers move around a commanding officer. Aware, attentive, waiting for orders. Arvin felt something shift in the air before he could name it. The scent hit next. Warm and dark and complex, like cedar smoke and something metallic underneath, and Arvin's alpha instincts did something they had never done before. They went very quiet. Not aggressive. Not challenging. Just quiet. Listening. The way you go quiet when you hear something and you can't tell yet if it's danger or music. Zale looked up the steps and found Arvin's eyes immediately. He smiled. Slowly. The kind of smile that isn't about warmth. He walked up the steps without being invited. Stopped 1 step below Arvin. Technically deferential in terms of height, but his posture didn't defer to anything, and said, "King Arvin. You're younger than the portraits suggest." Arvin blinked. "Prince Zale. The portraits were commissioned when I was 14. Explains it." Zale tilted his head slightly, still holding eye contact. "Thank you for the welcome. It wasn't a compliment. It was an evaluation that had reached a provisional conclusion." Arvin's council shifted collectively behind him. He could feel their discomfort like a second temperature in the air. He felt something else too. Something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that lived in the space between being unsettled and being intensely interested. He stepped aside and gestured toward the doors. "Please, come in." Zale stepped up level with him and walked through the doors first. Arvin watched him go. He stood there for exactly 2 seconds before following. The first 3 days were a performance on both sides, and both of them knew it. Zale sat in diplomatic sessions and spoke about trade routes and alliance terms and border security with the precision of someone who had spent years doing something most Omegas weren't allowed in the room for. He didn't ask for opinions. He offered positions and explained their logic and waited, with patient confidence, for agreement. Arvin's advisors hated him immediately. Arvin was fascinated. There were dinners. Long ones, the kind courts used to measure people when the formal meetings are done and the wine makes guards drop. Zale ate everything with obvious appreciation and talked to the kitchen staff by name by the second night and somehow made the oldest, most rigid lords at the table laugh with a single dry observation delivered without smiling. The incense was always burning, somewhere nearby. Arvin noticed it. Cedar, smoke, something else underneath, and assumed it was a Salvain custom. He didn't question it. It would have been rude to question it. He did notice that near it, his alpha instincts stayed unusually calm. Usually, when another alpha was present and dominant, he felt the familiar low-grade tension of 2 territorial natures in the same space. With Zale, it was different, quieter, like standing near something powerful enough that you don't feel the need to perform power yourself. He found it, and he hated admitting this to himself, deeply, uncharacteristically restful. On the 4th evening, they ended up in the castle library alone. This was not entirely accidental. Arvin had mentioned offhandedly that he spent evenings there, and Zale had appeared in the doorway an hour after dinner with a book already in his hand and asked, conversationally, if it was a shared space. They didn't talk about trade that night. Arvin asked about the scar. Zale looked at him with that measuring expression he wore like armor, and then apparently decided Arvin had earned the truth. He'd gotten it during a training accident when he was 20. His sparring partner hadn't known his designation. When they found out afterward, they were horrified. Not because he'd been hurt, but because they'd let an Omega train with them at all. "What did you do?" Arvin asked. "I outranked the sparring partner." Zale turned a page without looking at it. "And the commander who tried to end my training program." "How?" Zale looked up. "I convinced my father I was more valuable as a political weapon than a marriage commodity. That took considerably more effort than the spar." There was something in how he said it. Not bitterness exactly. More like the tone of someone describing a mountain they'd climbed. Acknowledging the difficulty without being dramatic about it. Arvin looked at him for a long moment. "Do you ever get tired of it?" "Of what?" "Having to be twice everything. Just to be taken seriously as anything." Zale was quiet for 3 full seconds. That was longer than he was usually quiet. "Yes," he said. "Just that." Arvin nodded slowly. He understood that kind of tiredness. He understood it in his bones. They sat in the library until past midnight, and neither of them remarked on how long they'd stayed. The rain started on the 7th night. Not gentle. The kind of rain that comes in from the coast like it has a grievance, heavy and relentless, rattling the stone-framed windows and soaking everything within seconds of exposure. Caldemir's older corridors leaked in 3 specific places that the stewards had been meaning to address for 2 years. Tonight they addressed them urgently with buckets. There was a section of the garden between the main wing and the guest quarters. Usually it was walked under covered archways. Tonight, a tree had come down in the wind and taken a section of the archway with it. Arvin didn't know Zale was in the garden until he looked out his study window and saw him there, standing in the full rain, looking at the fallen archway with an expression that suggested he was doing rapid calculations about alternate routes. He was soaked within moments. Arvin went down with a coat. They stood in the rain together for approximately 90 seconds while Zale assessed the damage and Arvin held the coat over both of them ineffectively and the wind made the whole thing pointless. Then they gave up and ran for the side door. Inside, dripping on the flagstones of a small antechamber, Arvin shook water from his hair and turned to say something. Probably something dry and self-deprecating about the Calderir weather, and stopped. The scent hit him. Not cedar. Not smoke. Something else underneath. Now washed clean by rain, rising without its disguise. Warm. Complex. Floral in a way that wasn't soft. More like the smell of a garden in the heat of summer. Something living and abundant and deeply alive. It was nothing like the composed, deliberate presence Zale had carried for 7 days. It was something that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to instinct. Omega. Unmistakably, completely, overwhelming Omega. Arvin went very still. Zale saw his face change and his entire expression. All that composed, deliberate control cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. "Ah," Zale said quietly. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Felt much longer. "The incense," Arvin said. His voice came out level, which surprised him. "Yes." "How long?" "Since before I arrived." Zale held eye contact with the steadiness of someone who has prepared for this conversation and is choosing not to run from it. "I needed the delegation to proceed as an equal negotiation. I needed your advisors not to dismiss me before I'd said a word. And me." Something moved in Zale's expression. "At first, yes. Then it became more complicated." Arvin turned and walked 3 steps toward the window. Not away from Zale. Just needing to move. His instincts were doing something completely unexpected. They weren't rising into dominance, into that alpha territorial response he would have predicted. They were going in the opposite direction. Like a held breath finally releasing. He stood there, wet and quietly shaken, and waited to feel angry. He waited, and found, underneath what he'd expected to feel, something that made no sense by any rule he'd ever been handed. Relief. He turned back around. I need you to be honest with me. All of it. From the beginning. So Zale told him. Standing in a cold antechamber dripping on the flagstones, he told him about the scar and the training and the years of building a reputation that required constantly outrunning what people assumed when they looked at him. He told him about his father's slow, reluctant respect and his brother's jealousy, and the moment he decided that if the world was going to underestimate him, he was going to use that as a strategy rather than a wound. He told him about the incense, how he'd found it, what it did, why he'd used it. He talked for a long time. He was not apologetic. He was exact. When he finished, he looked at Arvin with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd arrived, genuinely uncertain. Say something, Zale said. Arvin looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, the first dinner. When you corrected my trade advisor about the eastern border levies. Were you right? Zale blinked. Yes, obviously. The military garrison proposal on day 3. The one my general pushed back on. Also correct. Your general hasn't updated his tactical maps since your father's reign. I know. Arvin exhaled slowly. I've been trying to tell him for 2 years. Something in the air shifted. Not resolved. Not simple, but shifted. I'm not going to pretend, Arvin said, that none of this is strange. It is. You deceived my entire court. Yes. And I'm going to have to think carefully about what that means politically. Yes, Zale said again, still not apologetic. Still exact. But, Arvin stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, and when he looked up, there was something in his face that Zale hadn't expected. Something honest and unguarded. For 7 days I've been in the presence of someone who talks to me like I'm a person rather than a title. Who argues back. Who has opinions and evidence and no particular interest in telling me what I want to hear. He paused. Do you know how rarely that happens? Zale was quiet. I'm going to have to think about everything, Arvin said. But I'm also going to ask you not to leave. They didn't resolve it in one night. That's not how real things resolve. Over the next weeks, there were conversations that went badly and conversations that went well, and at least one argument so significant that Zale walked out and Arvin sat alone in his study for 2 hours, not quite willing to admit he was waiting for the sound of footsteps returning. The footsteps returned. Eventually, slowly, in the way that only things built carefully can be built, they started over. Arvin told Zale things he hadn't told anyone. About hating the performance of dominance. About the years of being told that strength meant never showing uncertainty, and how that particular lesson had given him a very effective public face and an extremely lonely private one. About his father, who had loved him but loved the role more, who had died without ever once asking Arvin what he wanted. What do you want? Zale asked him one evening. They were in the library again. It had become their place, the way places become things between people who keep returning to them. Arvin thought about it seriously, which itself felt rare, being asked and being expected to have a real answer rather than a diplomatic one. To run something that works, he said finally. Not to be impressive, not to be feared, for it to actually work. For the people inside these borders to be safe and fed and given decent lives. He paused. And to not have to be the largest and loudest thing in every room I walk into. Zale looked at him in that careful way he had, like he was reading something written small. I can be the largest and loudest thing, Zale said. I've been practicing. Arvin laughed. Surprised him. Genuine, unguarded laughter. The kind he didn't often manage. Zale's expression did something complicated and warm. There was a night, deep in what had become their careful and unspoken courtship, when the library was lit low and the fire had burned to coals and neither of them had been reading for an hour. Arvin reached across the space between their chairs and covered Zale's hand with his own. Zale looked down at it, then up. I'm not gentle, Zale said. Not a warning. More like a statement of self. I don't need gentle, Arvin said. I need real. Zale turned his hand over and held Arvin's properly. His grip was firm, certain, like everything else about him. They stayed like that for a very long time, saying nothing, the fire dying quietly beside them. It was the first honest thing either of them had done without strategy. The formal courtship was unusual by every standard of the five kingdoms, and the court gossiped about it with extraordinary dedication. An Omega leading negotiations. An Alpha King who deferred, visibly and without apparent distress, to his intended consort's judgment on military affairs. An engagement announcement that listed, in careful diplomatic language, a partnership of co-governance, war council to the Omega, domestic and civil council to the Alpha, as if this was not a radical restructuring of every marital norm in the region. Caused exactly as much chaos as you'd expect. And exactly as much as both of them had planned for. Because here is what nobody outside that library understood. Zale was the strategy. Arvin was the stability. Together they were something that neither of them could have been alone. Not just effective but genuinely formidable. The kind of partnership that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone in the room can feel it. The lords who'd dismissed Zale on day one found themselves sitting across from him in security councils where he knew their garrison numbers better than they did. The advisors who'd expected an Omega consort to be a beautiful, decorative presence in the background found themselves reporting to someone who had read every brief they'd written in the last 6 months and had follow-up questions. And Arvin, who had spent years being the largest thing in every room out of necessity, discovered what it was like to sit beside someone who could hold the weight with him. To not have to be the answer to everything. To come home at the end of a court day that required him to be a king and find Zale in the garden or the library or the kitchen arguing amiably with the head cook about spice trade logistics and feel something simple and enormous. The feeling of not being alone in it. The tethering was their secret. Not the event itself, that was tradition, recorded in the royal registers, witnessed by the head of the royal house in the formal observance. But what happened in the space before the ritual, in the hours that belonged only to them, that was something they kept. It was late spring. The windows of Arvin's chambers were open to the night air, warm enough finally to do that, and the candles burned low against the breeze. Zale had come to him not in the formal way, not with the deliberate composure he carried everywhere, but quietly, the way he moved in private, which was softer than the world knew. Arvin had been nervous. He would admit that privately, not because of the ritual itself. Because of what it meant. Tethering was permanent. The deep biological bond that alphas and omegas completed was not symbolic. It rewired something foundational. After, they would carry each other's scent permanently. They would feel each other's distress across distance. They would be at a level that had nothing to do with politics or crowns bound. He wanted it. Completely. That was what surprised him. Not the obligation of it. The wanting. Zale sat at the edge of the window looking out at the night, and when Arvin came to him, he turned. And he was unguarded in a way that only came out in the hours they kept for themselves. The armor was down. The precision was soft. He was just Zale. Tired from the week, glad to be here, not performing anything. Are you afraid? Arvin asked. I don't get afraid, Zale said. Then, after a pause, I'm also afraid. Arvin cupped his jaw, the scar rough under his thumb. He had touched it before. He would touch it forever. He said nothing for a moment, just held him like that, eye to eye, and let the silence say what neither of them was particularly good at saying directly. I choose you. Specifically. Not the role. Not the alliance. You. When they moved together, it wasn't graceful in the way stories make things graceful. It was warm and a little fumbling and deeply certain. Zale was, as he'd said, not particularly gentle. Neither was Arvin in the end, not because he needed to prove anything but because Zale responded to meeting him fully rather than being handled carefully, and Arvin discovered he could give that. The tethering itself happened in the last hour before dawn. The deep instinctual completion of the bond, Arvin's alpha nature and Zale's omega nature recognizing each other without pretense or performance for the first time. No incense. No armor. Just the truth of what they were to each other, settling into place like a key finding its lock. Afterward they lay quiet, Zale's head on Arvin's chest, Arvin's hand moving slowly through his hair. The new thread of the bond hummed between them, strange and warm and unmistakable. "Well," Zale said eventually into the dark. "Yeah," Arvin agreed. Neither of them elaborated. They didn't need to. 2 seasons after the tethering, Zale started sleeping more. Arvin noticed before Zale would admit it. He noticed the way he noticed everything about Zale now, with the heightened awareness that bonded alphas carry, like an extra frequency always tuned to one signal. He noticed the change in his scent too, subtly. Something deepening in it. Something round and warm and new. The royal physician confirmed it on a gray Tuesday morning with the calm professionalism of someone delivering news they've delivered many times before. Zale sat with the information for a full 10 minutes after the physician left. Arvin sat with him. "I didn't think," Zale started. Stopped. "I know. I've been traveling to 3 territories this quarter. I have 2 security councils and a border dispute arbitration scheduled." "I know." Zale looked at him. His expression was doing several things at once. Calculating, uncertain, something underneath that was neither of those things. Something that had no armor over it at all. "I'm not going to be someone who stops," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop. The arbitration is important. The Eastern Lords will walk all over your delegate if I'm not." "Zale." Arvin reached across and took his hand. "I'll go to the arbitration." Zale stared at him. "You hate diplomatic travel. I hate it less than you think. I hate performing being the largest thing in the room. Diplomacy is different. I'm actually decent at it when I don't have to be intimidating." Something in Zale's face did something Arvin had only seen a few times. It went soft in a way that had nothing strategic in it. "We're going to have to restructure the council briefings," Zale said, voice careful. "And the spring military assessments. We'll sort it. And I'm going to be difficult about this. I already know I will be." "I know," Arvin said, with the calm of someone who has long since decided that difficult is not a problem when the person is worth it. "I've been planning for that." Zale laughed. Short and surprised and real. Arvin held his hand tighter. The child was born in winter. Early morning. The kingdom was told by midday. What they were not told, officially, was what happened in the quiet hour before the formal announcement. The 2 of them in the warmth of the chamber with something new and very small between them, not yet a political reality, just a person impossibly small, impossibly present. Arvin held the baby and looked at Zale with an expression he couldn't have composed if he'd tried. Zale was exhausted in a way that was different from any exhaustion Arvin had ever seen on him. He was also, and this was the thing Arvin would carry for the rest of his life, completely unguarded. No armor. Nothing left for armor. Just open. "Don't," Zale said. "I'm not doing anything. You're going to say something unbearable." "I wasn't going to say anything." "Your face," Zale said, "is saying something unbearable." Arvin looked down at the child, then back at Zale. "You can have the arbitration back in the spring," he said. Zale closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. He would deny it for the rest of his life. "I know," he said. Here is the thing about Zale and Arvin. The histories would call it a partnership. The political analysts would call it a restructuring of traditional governance. The progressive scholars would write extensively about what their reign meant for Omega rights across the 5 kingdoms, and they would be correct to write it. But none of that captures the actual thing. The actual thing was 2 people who'd been performing their roles so long that they'd almost forgotten there was something underneath the performance. And then they found each other, in the most unlikely way, through deception and rain and a library that became their place. And they were given the extraordinary rare chance to just stop performing. To be what they actually were. Zale was the war and the strategy and the voice in the room that nobody ignored. Arvin was the steady hand and the home and the person who made sure the small things ran, and that the people inside their kingdom were treated like people and not pieces on a board. Neither of them was what the world had told them to be. Both of them were, somehow, exactly right. They say Prince Zale once arrived at a foreign court and within 20 minutes of sitting down had restructured the trade negotiation so completely that the hosting lord asked, quietly, which kingdom he was king of. Zale looked at him for a moment with those eyes that measured everything. "I'm an Omega," he said. "My husband is the king." The lord looked confused. "But you're—" "Yes," said Zale, perfectly pleasantly. "I am." And he turned back to the maps. The stories that came out of that court afterward traveled fast and wide, the way good stories do, because they contain something people need. A question answered in a way nobody expected. A shape that doesn't match the frame. There's a reason people are still telling this one. Some truths are like that. You have to hear them at the right time, in the right way, in the dark, when you're paying attention. And then you can't unhear them.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.